Never really said this out loud, and I don't really mind doing so, but, I always thought to myself, if I was gay, Hugh Jackman. And there's a particular shot of him in this movie that made me look at myself and go, yep. Hey everyone, Divvy here, doing another movie review, and this time it is for another summer movie jam-packed into the month of May because I, for the life of me, cannot think of anything else that's coming out in the rest of the summer, so it's gonna be a tough one to call here, but almost every tentpole movie is in May. And here we have another one, X-Men, Days of Future Past. And this one is called X-Men. It's been a while since we had an actual X-Men movie and not just a Wolverine standalone film. And how do you do that? By bringing literally everyone together. This is X-Men Days of Future Past, which takes place in not only the past of the X-Men universe, but as well as the future and even, well, technically there's no real present. That's actually one of the things I liked about the movie, is that there was no real present. It's all about the past and the future. And this movie sees Logan, aka the Wolverine, traveling back into the past in order to warn the past versions of both Charles Xavier and Eric Lehnsherr, aka Magneto, of a coming threat that can not only wipe out all of mutants, but humankind as a whole. And despite not being perfect, I dare say this was a really great movie. It wasn't just good, it was definitely great. When I came to the conclusion that I can hardly find anything that to really complain about. I do have my nitpicks because, like I said, this movie is not particularly perfect, but it's definitely one of the signature X-Men films. When you think of the best X-Men films, you don't think of Wolverine, X-Men Origins Wolverine, you don't think of X-Men The Last Stand. In fact, I'm going to go as far as to say that you don't even think of last year's The Wolverine, because like I said in my review for that movie, I wasn't that huge of a fan of it. I thought it was good, but I never thought of it to be one of the definitive X-Men movies. But this one certainly is. First of all, one of the great things about it is that you literally have everybody back from across the universe of X-Men, and in terms of the cinematic universe of X-Men. You got the director, Bryan Singer, who may be going a little Roman Polanski on us right now, but we can definitely agree that he is tied together to the X-Men universe like he belongs. You know, stop doing some of that Giant Slayer shit, and just don't do any of that unless you really have a good story on your hands that you can tell properly, like The Usual Suspects. And I actually kind of like Valkyrie, or however you pronounce the name of that movie, but if he's doing another X-Men movie, I am there. But you got Wolverine being reprised by Hugh Jackman once again. You got Jennifer Lawrence as Mystique. You got Nicholas Hoult as Beast. But then you got returning actors who are playing different versions of characters from the Bryan Singer movies, such as Sir Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart as Magneto and Charles Xavier respectively, as well as other characters that you have seen in the past of the X-Men movies, like Shawn Ashmore as Iceman and Ellen Page as Kitty Pryde, and whoever plays Colossus. I'm sorry about that. But then you also got characters from X-Men First Class, such as James McAvoy and Michael Fassbender playing the young versions of Xavier and Eric Lehnsherr, aka Magneto, respectively. It's got everybody. And that's obviously one of the awesome things about it, because you just can't help but marvel at the fact that Bryan Singer was able to take these two universes together and make them collaborate, while at the same time making it sense within the terms of the story, because obviously the story has to do with time travel, but they're not going to make it seem like, oh, he just jumps through a portal and then boom, he's there. They make it seem so that both the past and the future are happening in the same time, such as how a character literally says in this movie. They're both happening at the same time, so you gotta be careful, and there's stakes. There's stakes in the story where anything can happen. Now granted, considering the fact that you introduce the element of time travel, whenever something happens that's very drastic and very worthy of, very gasp-worthy, like it makes you go, oh my god, that just happened. It kind of takes the oomph away from that when you think about the fact that you got a character that's in the past that can kind of toy around with this, so it doesn't have that big of an impact. I mean, there's certain things that happen in the climax of this movie that people were looking at, and in the theater they're like, oh my god, that just happened. I didn't get that reaction because I still thought about the fact that we got Wolverine in the past, who may or may not change things. I mean, I do know that some things might go a different way, but because of the fact you got the element of time travel in there, I wasn't as affected as everybody else was in the theater by some of these big things that happened in the climax. But that didn't take away from the fact that this movie was actually really well written, not only for a comic book movie, but for a movie that is faithful to its roots. It felt like I was reading a comic book, but in the good sense of the term, in the way where I'm reading a comic book and I can look at that comic book and be like, this is a part of literature. This is a part of pop culture art, and I can sincerely say that about this movie. It had one of the things that I really enjoyed about First Class, which is to make these mutants relevant to their time. I mean, we spend the majority of this movie in 1973, more so than in the future, but the future is still important, especially what's going on there and what stakes there are in that time. But we spend the majority of the movie in the past, and we get that very nostalgic feeling that we get in First Class. I'm not saying that I feel nostalgic for some of the things that you see in the background of the time, because obviously I was not born in the 70s, but it had that very grounded feel that made these mutants part of history, like First Class did, especially when it came to the missile crisis in Cuba. This movie does the same thing with characters such as President Nixon and some of the things that are going on in that time, but less so to the extent of First Class, because this movie focuses on Xavier, Lyncher, aka Magneto. I don't know why I keep calling him Lyncher, let's just call him Magneto, Wolverine, and Mystique. All the other characters serve the plot to an extent, but that actually leads to one of my nitpicks about the movie, which is that I was hoping to see some of these mutants more. Some mutants were used in the adequate amount. I felt like we saw them on screen for the right amount of time, and they did the things that I wanted them to do. Especially some of the mutants that are in the future, guarding things while things are taking place. Those mutants were used the adequate amount. I'm like, okay, they're doing their job, and I didn't necessarily need to see more of them, but when we did see him, they were cool. But it's a shame that one of these mutants happens to be Wolverine himself. Now, I'm not expecting to see more of him in terms of a character, because we got plenty of that with 2 standalone Wolverine movies, especially one of them being the Wolverine from last year. We already got enough of him as a character, in terms of him being developed as a character and as him being studied as that. I simply just wanted to see 1 or 2 more sequences of him being badass and being awesome like we know Wolverine to do. But we didn't really get enough of that. But that's come to be expected when you have so many mutants in the movie. You got so many that I was completely expecting to some of them be in the background. And like I said, some of them I was fine with them being in the background because, you know, I don't necessarily to see this character be throughout the entire movie. I don't need that. And I was fine with that. But it's a shame that not only is Wolverine one of those characters, but Quicksilver, who is awesome in this movie. This movie makes him so cool that it's a huge shame that there's literally a scene that says, hey, bye-bye, you're gone. I'm not going to say what happens with him, but the scene literally says, you're no longer in the movie, and it's a huge shame because he is one of the best characters in the movie, and he has one of the best sequences in the movie. I can literally see that sequence over and over again because it was awesome, and it's a huge shame that we didn't get to see enough of him, but we will in Avengers 2. It just won't be the same character. It won't be the same kind of Quicksilver, unfortunately. It'll be played by Kick-Ass, which I wouldn't complain too much, but after seeing him in Godzilla, I'm kind of like, okay, Joss, let's make that face emote a little bit more. But James McAvoy, Michael Fassbender, and Mystique kill it as their characters. They were the main focus of this story because if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't really have a story to begin with, so they delivered, not only in terms of the performances, but also the writers with their characters. They were written perfectly for the kind of characters that they were in the X-Men universe. And they just killed it. They really held the entire story together. And I just couldn't commend them enough. Now, what about Peter Dinklage as Trask? Performance-wise, Dinklage can do no wrong. I mean, he's freaking Tyrion Lannister, for God's sakes. I mean, I don't even watch Game of Thrones, and I already know that he's a badass on that show because I've seen scenes of him in action because everybody keeps saying how amazing he is and how he was so worthy of that Emmy, and I wanted to check him out, and sure enough, he's awesome. He makes me want to watch the show, but then I think about the fact that everybody just spoils the living crap out of that movie on the internet, so I'm like, I'd rather just not watch it. That way I don't have to go through the frustration of having to avoid all those spoilers. But he kills it in this movie as well as Trask. I'm just a little mixed as to how I should feel about that character, because the way Mystique and Magneto and even Xavier to an extent, they act as if this character is just evil. He experiments. He does experiments that are completely wrong, morally wrong, and he's just a downright bad guy. But when it comes to him as a character, I never really saw him as a bad guy. I just saw him as a character that had a different viewpoint as the mutants. In fact, he has a scene that literally threw me off. I'm like, okay, I don't know how to feel about this character. I don't know if he's a good guy or a bad guy. And I guess in terms of complexity, that's kind of a good thing. I'm like, okay, he's not just a straightforward bad guy, but it's not a straightforward good guy that then turns into a bad guy. He's really a guy to really think about where he's coming from. Because some of the words that he says during that particular scene really stuck with me. I'm like, yeah, this is a very interesting viewpoint that this character has. And I guess that's one of the things I really enjoyed about his character. But I guess in the long run, his character is someone that I'm going to have to sit with and think about. But this is an X-Men movie, and you can have all the characters and all the story, but we would feel a little disappointed if we didn't have awesome sequences to really showcase what these mutants can do. And boy, do we get them. From the opening fight that was previewed at the MTV Movie Awards to the climax, there's so many sequences in this movie where I'm like, oh my god, this is amazing, and wow. There were certain moments that they showcased the 3D rather well, especially with some things coming towards the screen. Now, does that warrant an actual 3D price? I'm gonna say not necessarily, but it was still cool to see. I never really felt ripped off watching it in 3D, but you'll be just as satisfied watching it in 2D, because there's so many action sequences that were just amazing, and they used their powers effectively. I'm like, okay, why can't you just do it? Oh wait, you just did it. That's awesome. And I already said it. One of the best sequences was the one with Quicksilver, and I wish we had more of him. But what we did get is what might be one of the most played scenes on YouTube later on when this thing gets released on Blu-ray. My last nitpick would have to be that there's a particular subplot with Xavier that was recently kind of unfolded in the form of a clip that 20th Century Fox decided to release, and fortunately I did not watch the clip, so I didn't know what it was all about. Thank God. But after watching the movie, I'm like, you know, I appreciate this particular subplot being in this movie, but when you really think about it after having seen the movie, it could have done without it. Like, you could have cut this entire thing out, and we would still kind of have that struggle within Xavier that he has been having this whole time, which was brilliantly written and really well performed by James McAvoy, because it really layered Xavier in this movie, and particularly his past self, not so much his future self. But they did a great job at writing Xavier, that this particular subplot didn't really need to be in the movie, but with it being in the movie, it didn't really detract it from the plot itself. But even with the nitpicks, the cool action sequences, the really good characters, and the really well written story that they were able to take from the comics made for a really good movie. But it wasn't until the end that this developed into a great movie. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but let's just say that the ending really looked at the fans and said, you're welcome. Like I said, I can't get into too much detail, and that's why I will be having a spoiler discussion about this movie within the week, but my god, that ending was like, haha, very clever writers. I don't know who you are. I don't know your name specifically. And of course, some of this could be commended towards Bryan Singer, but kudos. Kudos for what you just did. It was that ending alone that made me think that this indeed was a great movie, and for that I give X-Men Days of Future Past a 9 out of 10. It barely crossed that mark, but it's still one of the greatest movies I've seen so far this year, and definitely one of the definitive X-Men films in the franchise. And it leaves us with a lot of unanswered questions, but the good questions. The questions that you think about it and you're like, okay, I don't need to know every single thing. In fact, everything that the previous movies set up, particularly First Class, got answered in Days of Future Past. But there's others that are stemmed in this movie that the sequels are going to need to answer. Specifically, X-Men Apocalypse, which was just recently announced, and the end credit sequence alludes to, at least I believe it does. And Obviously, there is an end credit scene, but it's at the very end, so you're gonna have to do a little bit of waiting, but be sure to stick around for that. So thank you guys for watching. Let me know what you guys thought of X-Men Days of Future Past, and be sure to stay patient for my spoiler discussion within the week. But until then, see you guys later.